Hello, class. Welcome to your first adaptive lesson. Today we're talking about Reconstruction and the Gilded Age. So we pick up right where the Civil War ended in April 1865. And we're going to talk about how different groups reacted to the end of the war in different ways. So first of all, nearly 4 million African Americans were suddenly free. And the country didn't really know what to do about this. I can't stress how immense this was. There were 4 million people suddenly thrust into a position of relative uncertainty. The country didn't know how to handle it. Would these people become full on citizens? Would they go back to Africa? And one thing that we tend to overlook when we look at this period of history is how African Americans really didn't just sit on their hands and wait for white leaders to tell them what would happen to them. In fact, they really took their future in their own hands. Many of them. Many became political activists in that they petitioned the government and military leaders for more rights and more privileges. And they also formed many organizations in order to help themselves. The first example of them doing this is called Special Field Order 15, which was a meeting between African American leaders in Georgia and Union General William Tecumseh Sherman. And this took place in the final months of the war. Now, these African American leaders took it upon themselves to petition white leaders for their own needs. Now, African Americans had always done a lot to improve their own situations, even in slavery. There's lots of examples of slaves sort of taking what they could get and then using it to improve their own situation. Now, that's not to say that slavery wasn't terrible and that they suffered a lot, but it does mean that African Americans weren't just, they just didn't roll over, right? Um, they actually tried hard to improve their own situation. And that's sort of a constant theme that we'll see throughout the course, not just with African Americans, but with other minority groups like Native Americans, Mexican Americans, even some of the white immigrants like Irish people and Eastern Europeans who came to the country. Oh, and Asian Americans also. So keep that in mind. But now African Americans had this new situation in which the sky was the limit, essentially, or at least they felt that way. Um, this was a whole new realm that they were in, and they had the potential to improve their situation beyond what they could do, what they could have done under slavery. Now, as for the white slave owners in the South, their world was essentially turned upside down, and they really didn't know how to deal with it. Their economy was pretty much destroyed because slavery was over. They lost 60% of their wealth. Their way of life was completely disrupted. So imagine being a person who believed in a way of life, in your own way of life, so strongly that it was an essential part of your religious makeup and your own social identity. I mean, slavery wasn't just an economic system; it was a way of life. It was a belief system. Southern planters, white Southerners, would go to church and they would hear sermons from their preachers straight from the Bible about why slavery was part of God's plan. Then 1865 comes around, they lose the war, and suddenly slavery is done, which essentially means that God's plan is disrupted. So you can imagine the confusion that this would cause in them. They weren't quite sure how to take it, so they found ways to sort of maintain the status quo. Firstly, they did their best to maintain the social order that they were used to, which was, African Americans at the bottom, very bottom. This essentially meant that they would find ways to do this. One of the most effective ways to do this was through terrorism. At this time, you see groups like the Ku Klux Klan forming and lynching becoming very prevalent across the South. And for African American women, this was especially terrifying. Now, there were a lot of issues with gender in Southern society, and while it's true that Southern whites were afraid of African Americans climbing the social ladder and gaining economic privileges and political authority. What they were really afraid of was the mixing of the races, right? Especially African American men and white women. It did not compute for them, and they went to great lengths to avoid that. So they sought to maintain control over African Americans, the bodies of African Americans, just as they had during slavery. Um, and again, this will be another constant theme throughout the course. So again, keep this in mind. Another way that they dealt with the changes was that they tried to rewrite the narrative around the Civil War. So in the early 1860s, just as the Civil War was getting started, you had Southern leaders coming out and making proclamations that they were leaving the Union in order to maintain slavery, in order to maintain their way of life. Then they lose the war. So the reason for fighting the war suddenly wasn't good enough, so they backpedaled. And they began to, whoops, dropped my phone. They began to rewrite their own history. They say, no, we didn't fight the Civil War to maintain slavery. It was more about maintaining states' rights, and that the Northerners were the real aggressors. I mean, even though the South fired on Fort Sumter, I know that, you know, everybody knows that. But anyway, we'll just let that be for now. So during this time, you have them rewriting their narrative, and this is when you start to see Civil War monuments being erected around the South. And this was done by Civil War veterans, but mostly done actually by women groups in the South who wanted to sort of maintain the memory of a lifestyle that was gone. You also had Southern boosters who were trying to bring manufacturers to the South. And they did this by writing these really extravagant essays about how the South was perfect for industry. There were lots of rivers. It was a land just waiting to be tapped. And also that relations between whites and African Americans were beautiful, and that everything was really peaceful. They also wrote about how they actually respected Lincoln and the other Union leaders. So it's pretty interesting what they were doing to try and rebuild their society. However, it would take decades, well into the 20th century, before the Southern economy finally recovered. Now, as for whites in the North, things couldn't have been better for them. The Civil War exploded their economy in the best way possible. Manufacturing took off, and it brought the country into what is called now the Second Industrial Revolution. Industries, especially railroads, sort of took over the country, both economically and politically, which made a very small number of men very, very rich. And these men were called robber barons, and their influence led the country into a period called the Gilded Age, which was essentially a period of extreme economic growth without the prosperity that should have come with it. So then at the end of the war, there were two major questions. What does the country do with 4 million African Americans? And also, how do they put the country back together? And so when then Lincoln died, these questions become even more profound. And Andrew Johnson takes over, and not to give anything away, but he was pretty inept. Lincoln had chosen him as vice president for purely political reasons. He was from Tennessee, and so he thought that might appeal to some of the Southerners who were kind of on the fence about whether or not to join the Union or support the Union cause. And no one had anticipated that Lincoln would be killed. So Johnson basically falls backwards into the White House, and is way out of his realm. Doesn't handle it very well, and quickly loses the support of Congress. And Congress reins him in. They impeach him. He's not removed from office by one single vote. So he stays in as president, but Congress basically takes over. And the people running Congress at this time are called Radical Republicans, and they begin a new era called Radical Reconstruction. I know, real creative, but they were able to control the country and set the terms by which the country would be put back together. And the changes that they made were immense and they were drastic. They didn't last. Most of them didn't last, but there was this period of time between 1865 and 1877 where some really interesting things were happening before the country said, "Oh, this is too much. We can't handle it," and they backpedaled. It was too much too quickly. So that's this week's lesson, and I hope you enjoy it.